Hey friends, tonight we step into the shadowed chambers of ancient Egypt, not to admire gold masks or towering pyramids, but to uncover something quieter, stranger, and far more powerful. This isn't just about beauty, it's about spells traced in Kohl, pigments whispered over like prayers, and colors used not for decoration, but for protection, healing, and unseen influence. So before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Only if you truly connect with what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift together into the magical world of Egyptian makeup. The Kohl line that doubled as a spell against night spirits. Imagine yourself walking through a stone corridor, the air thick with the cool scent of earth and aged pigment. Faint torchlight flickers across the painted walls. Scenes of boats, offerings, and gods with heads of animals and eyes outlined in black. In one chamber, a figure rests eternally in painted repose, their gaze still lined in the deep sweep of Kohl, as though they only just drifted to sleep. That line, drawn so carefully around the eyes, was more than a cosmetic touch. It was a spell. In ancient Egypt, beauty and protection were rarely separated. The Kohl applied beneath the eyes of nobles and priests, merchants and scribes, served both to enhance and to shield. Its dark trace, composed not from soot but from galena, a naturally occurring mineral, was ground into fine powder, then mixed with oils or animal fat. The mixture was stored in small jars of alabaster or clay, with delicate applicators carved from bone, ivory, or wood. When drawn along the lid, it cooled the skin beneath the harsh sun. It kept flies away from the eyes, a practical comfort. But more importantly, it formed a barrier between the self and what lay beyond the visible. A barrier not just to glare or insects, but to spirits. Night, in Egyptian belief, was not merely a time of darkness. It was a realm in which boundaries softened. The hours after sundown brought more than dreams. They brought visitations. Spirits of the restless, of the vengeful, or of the jealous might pass unseen. They could slip into rooms, breathe into dreams, or drain vitality. Protection was required, and it came in many forms: amulets, prayers, rituals. And for the eyes Kohl, to wear the dark line was to invoke the protection of divine vision. The gods Horus and Ra, both intimately associated with the sun, with order, and with the clarity of sight, were evoked with every sweep of the brush. In some tombs, inscriptions explain that the Kohl was placed to guard against those who walk in shadow. Not metaphor, but method, and the eyes were seen not simply as sensory organs, but as powerful thresholds, doors through which energy could flow, both in and out. Unprotected, they were vulnerable. Lined, they were guarded. The very act of applying the Kohl was often accompanied by quiet incantations, recited not aloud but under breath. Short lines invoking peace, clarity, or the name of a protective deity. Tomb paintings echo this intent. Among the prayers found inscribed in burial chambers, several contain visual motifs that mirror the exact curve of the eyeliner. A sweeping arc beneath the eyes of painted guardians. Lines that end in upward curls, echoing the tail of a falcon or the gaze of a goddess. These were not random decorations. They were memory, ritual, and defense combined. And so, each morning, application was more than habit. It was a ritual renewal. The mirror, made of polished copper, was not simply to check for smudges, but to witness the self becoming armored. Children might have their eyes lined by elders during festivals. Soldiers bore it into battle. Even mummified faces were painted with Kohl before burial, as though sleep and death shared the same threshold. And one must pass into both with the same vigilance. There is something tender in this. This idea that to care for one's appearance was also to care for the soul. That the act of adornment could be an act of spiritual protection. That beauty and belief were never in conflict, but layered gently together. And as centuries passed, the practice spread. Beyond the Nile Valley, through trade and contact, Kohl made its way into other cultures. Persia, India, the Arabian Peninsula. In each, it retained both practical and mystical purposes. But in Egypt, it had begun not as vanity, but as vision. Sight, yes, but sacred sight. The power to perceive clearly and be unseen by that which wished to intrude. Even today, scholars examining burial jars find residues of galena carefully stored in cosmetics containers beside protective texts. A reminder that long after death, one still required shielding. The night, after all, never truly ceased to be a place of risk. And so, as you picture an ancient noble reclining beneath linen canopies, the desert air cooling, you might imagine the moment when, before rest, they take the small jar from a carved niche. The Kohl is soft, dark, smooth. They apply it in silence, feeling not only the touch of stone to skin, but the steady calm of tradition. An eye protected, a dream watched over. Sleep now, with that thought, that once, a line of black beneath the eye was a spell cast each evening against the unseen, and that even the quietest acts of care can hold ancient power. The green eye paint that channeled messages from the gods. Imagine yourself standing inside a stone chamber deep within a temple. The air still and warm, scented faintly of oil, myrrh, and dust that has clung to sandstone for centuries. The walls are covered in faint carvings and lines of script, symbols that dance just beyond understanding. There is no sound but the quiet flicker of a flame. Somewhere, out of sight, incense burns low, releasing a fine green smoke. A figure sits cross-legged near the altar. His eyes are closed, but the lids shimmer with a deep green powder, catching the light from the flame as if lit from within. This was not simply decoration. It was, according to the priests who lived and served here, a key, a substance that bridged the mortal and the divine. This green pigment was made from powdered malachite, a mineral pulled from the desert's rock and ground to a fine, gleaming dust. It was mixed with oil or animal fat, then applied around the eyes in wide strokes, leaving a thick band that curved out past the temples. In tomb paintings and statues, you can still see its presence, an emerald line defining the gaze of those who once peered into other realms. For the ancient Egyptian priests, this was not mere ornament. It was believed that malachite, especially when placed near the eyes, opened the inner vision, that it allowed a person, particularly one trained in stillness and ritual, to perceive truths hidden from the ordinary senses. What we might now call meditation or trance, they understood as communion. The term often used was Rouge, meaning not only green, but fresh, whole, alive. Green was the color of new growth along the Nile, of fertility, of renewal. To paint the eyes with malachite was not only to enhance one's sight, but to prepare the self as a vessel for insight, divine, ancestral, and cosmic. The ritual often began before sunrise, in a secluded chamber, often carved into the side of the temple and sealed against noise. A priest would cleanse his body with natron and cold water. He would sit on a mat of woven reeds, facing east. The pigment would be prepared with quiet care, ground anew, never reused. It was applied with a slender bone tool, each stroke deliberate. Then came silence. In some texts, this moment is described as a stilling of the breath. The body quieted, the heartbeat slowed, and the priest waited, not for thought, but for something else. Not sleep, not dream, but a threshold between both. And then, sometimes, not always, visions would come. Colors not seen in the waking world. Patterns of stars. Shapes of deities with forms both familiar and strange. At times, words were heard. Riddles or instructions. Fragments of hymns. Warnings of future events. On the chamber walls, these visions were sometimes recorded. Not as literal events, but as combinations of symbols. A jackal beneath a crescent moon, a boat sailing backward across reeds, a falcon eye shedding tears of flame. These were not always explained. Their meaning was preserved only in the memories of the priesthood, passed on in whispered commentary. One temple archive, now fragmented, tells of a priest who saw a green serpent rising from the sand, its body wrapped in human faces, each singing a different chant. He emerged from the trance with a new hymn, which was later inscribed on a temple pillar. Another record speaks of a woman priest who, upon applying the pigment, saw the god Thoth weighing hearts in a mirror of still water. She later advised the pharaoh on a decision that changed the course of the royal court. Of course, it is possible that the pigment had physical effects as well. Malachite is a copper-based mineral. Ingested, it is toxic, but absorbed through the skin in small amounts. Especially near the sensitive membranes of the eye, it may have produced strange sensations, a warmth, a tingling, a slight disorientation. Combined with fasting, chanting, darkness, and rhythmic breathing, it could very well have altered perception in subtle but powerful ways. The practice was never shared openly. Only the most trusted members of the priesthood used the pigment this way. For others, malachite was decorative, used in jewelry, burial masks, or as a protective line against the glare of the sun. But for those who knew the older rites, it was a doorway. As centuries passed and dynasties rose and fell, these traditions faded. The meaning of the symbols carved in those chamber walls became harder to interpret. The paint pots were buried beneath collapsed ceilings. In time, all that remained were hints. Green powder found near eye sockets in tombs, small mixing palettes stained dark, and inscriptions that speak of visions, but not their source. Yet the idea endures, that color, mineral, and ritual can combine to shift perception. That sight is not limited to what light reveals. That somewhere in the stillness behind the eyes, other images wait. Today, malachite is sometimes used in art, in pigment, and in stone. It is still beautiful, still green, still gleaming, but rarely is it approached as it once was. With reverence, silence, and the belief that it might allow a person not just to see, but to be seen, by powers older and more patient than memory. And so the chambers sleep now, quiet in their stone. But on some forgotten wall, deep beneath the sand, a carved line of script still waits. It speaks not of battles or kings, but of a vision. A priest seated in stillness, eyes rimmed in green, listening to something that only those with painted lids could hear. The rouge that was buried with warnings never to remove it. Imagine yourself walking through the dim interior of a tomb, not one freshly robbed or crumbled with time, but newly sealed, just as it would have been millennia ago. The stone is smooth and cool, the air still, pressed down by centuries. Your footsteps echo softly. On the walls, painted figures gaze outward with almond-shaped eyes, eternally calm. Among the images, boats, offerings, gods. There are lines of text, written not to be read aloud, but to be obeyed. One passage stands out. Let no water fall on her face, for to cleanse it is to wake her. It's a subtle warning, not unlike many that line the interiors of ancient tombs. But this one is different. It doesn't threaten defilers with snakes or fire, or divine vengeance. It warns against washing a face, against removing something applied with care. A pigment, a red stain, buried deep beneath layers of linen, sealed away from light and time, lay women, mothers, wives, priestesses, whose faces bore a final touch, not of death, but of life, a soft, vivid red on the cheeks, carefully brushed before the final wrapping. Rouge, made from ground ochre or cinnabar, applied not to please the gods but to preserve memory. The living warmth of blood and skin, a sign not of mourning, but of dignity, vitality, presence. In ancient Egypt, the dead were not simply discarded. They were maintained, preserved, adorned. The process of mummification was not an act of freezing time, but of preparing for eternity. And part of that preparation, especially in the later periods, included the use of cosmetics, eyeliner made from Kohl, oils scented with myrrh, and rouge, pigment pressed gently into the skin as if to say, "Remember me this way." The cheeks were particularly symbolic. In many funerary texts, red was the color of life, of protection. To place it on the cheeks was to affirm that the individual had not simply faded away, but had passed with grace. The pigment was often applied during the final ritual washing before burial, then sealed beneath the bandages. It was meant to remain untouched, and some tombs made that clear. Warnings painted on stone or written on shrouds instructed future hands to leave it be. Not because of vanity, but because of belief. Rouge was not just cosmetic, it was protective. It sealed something in, and to remove it, especially with water, was thought to disturb the harmony of the afterlife. Water, after all, was sacred and powerful. It was used in rites of purification, but it could also undo what was meant to endure. Washing the pigment might be interpreted as erasing the final rites, undoing the spell that preserved both body and soul. And so the inscription said clearly, sometimes sternly, "Let no one cleanse the face. Let no one unbind the cheek." For archaeologists centuries later, it became a point of curiosity. In some tombs, the pigment remained stark even after long decay. In others, it had faded, leaving only faint traces in linen. Occasionally, attempts to clean or study the face of a mummy would uncover the red beneath, and with it the warning. Many learned quickly to leave it untouched, not out of superstition, perhaps, but respect. The rouge itself was often simple in composition. Red ochre, a natural iron oxide, was ground finely and mixed with animal fat or plant oil. In wealthier tombs, cinnabar might be used, a brilliant red pigment made from mercury sulfide, more vivid and rarer. The choice of pigment reflected not only wealth, but also purpose. Red ochre was sacred to Hathor, the goddess of joy, motherhood, and beauty. To wear it in burial was to draw her favor. And unlike the stark cosmetics seen on statues or wall paintings, those deep black eyes and sharp outlines, rouge was subtler, almost tender. It implied warmth, humanity, a memory of who the person had been when alive, sitting by a brazier, laughing beside children, eyes crinkled with mirth. The red on their cheeks said, "This is how they lived, and perhaps this is how they wish to be remembered." There are records from burial texts and temple inventories that suggest rouge was part of the standard mortuary offerings, particularly for women. Vessels of pigment were sometimes placed in tombs, either for symbolic reapplication or for use in the afterlife. In that sense, the deceased did not only wear the pigment, but carried it with them, an enduring connection to their self-image and place in the world. And yet, the warnings persisted. Do not wash. Do not remove. Perhaps because this last cosmetic layer represented more than mere tradition. It was a seal, a closure of earthly identity, intended to carry through into eternity. Of course, in time, the pigments faded, bandages decayed, warnings were ignored or lost. But in certain dry tombs, tucked behind layers of sand and silence, the color remains. Faint, but unmistakable. A tiny flash of red against gray linen. A memory in mineral. You might wonder why such care was taken for a feature that no one was meant to see again. But in ancient belief, the body was a mirror of the soul's readiness. To be buried whole, well-dressed, with the appropriate signs of life, was to ensure a peaceful passage and recognition in the afterlife. The rouge, then, was not decoration. It was declaration. I lived. I mattered. I continue. And so the warning, not a curse in the cinematic sense, not a sudden bolt of misfortune, but a soft boundary, a gentle insistence. Let the face remain as it was. Let the cheek retain its glow. Let no water fall. Let no careless hand disturb the dignity of the one beneath. Now imagine yourself drifting back from the tomb, away from the sealed door and painted warnings, away from the hush of stone and into the quiet dark of your own room. The red pigment remains unwashed, undisturbed, still holding a trace of life. Let your thoughts rest there, on a soft cheek, brushed once with care, and left untouched for 1,000 years. The gold dust mixed into makeup to reflect sun deities. Imagine a warm courtyard deep within a temple complex, where the morning sun filters through carved stone screens. The air is still, filled with the faint scent of pressed lotus oil and sandalwood ash. In a shaded room just off the corridor, a bowl rests on a low table. Inside, a fine powder glimmers faintly, gold dust, ground so finely it clings to the fingertips like pollen. Beside it, a pot of dark kohl, a dish of crushed malachite, and soft brushes made from goat hair. This was the dressing room of a temple dancer, not a performer in the modern sense, but a figure of ritual importance, one whose body and movement served not entertainment, but divine rhythm. Her gestures mirrored stories older than paper. Her face, her skin, her presence. Each element was a deliberate instrument of worship, and on her eyelids, her cheekbones, sometimes even along the arms and collarbones, she wore gold. The particles were minute, too small to weigh, too scattered to be fashioned into coins. But under sunlight, as she turned, the shimmer caught fire, not to dazzle the human eye, but to direct light upward. In some traditions, the temple courtyard itself was aligned with the sun's path, and her movements traced that same arc. It was not simply makeup. It was reflection, illumination, in the most literal and sacred sense. In various ancient cultures, Egyptian, South Indian, Mesopotamian, and others, the concept of sunlight was more than physical. It was a form of presence. The rays of the sun were not just beams but messengers, extending the hand of a deity into the visible world. To reflect sunlight deliberately was not vanity. It was offering. Gold held a unique place in this, not just for its scarcity or beauty, but for its incorruptibility. It did not tarnish. It did not rot. It remained. In myth, it was said to resemble the flesh of the gods. In temple architecture, gold leaf adorned peaks and thresholds not for status, but to catch first light. So too, on the body, gold was applied sparingly, not smeared but tapped in with precision. Around the eyes, the brow, the temples. It was mixed with natural oils, crushed minerals, or even flour pastes. Some formulas were guarded by temple scribes. Others were passed down from older dancers to apprentices, whispered over slow hours of preparation. The gold did not mark rank. Even senior dancers wore little. It was not for the audience. It was for the alignment. When the dance began, the rays of the rising sun entered the hall, filtered through incense, and struck the bodies in motion. The shimmer of gold answered back. Their dressing rooms were carved with more than mirrors. Along the inner walls were inscriptions, lines of hymn, invocations to solar deities, and careful geometric motifs that echoed the journey of the sun across the seasons. These carvings were not merely decorative. Some served as guides for posture, others as memory cues for mantras. A dancer did not simply learn steps, she absorbed cycles. Imagine the silence of such a room in early morning. A thick stone floor, cool under bare feet. A bronze vessel filled with rose water. A comb carved from wood. And on the walls, verses in old script. To reflect is to guide. To shimmer is to echo. Let the eye carry fire without flame. Not scripture exactly, but spiritual instruction. A reminder that her role was not her own. In the space between flesh and light, she became a path. This use of gold in makeup would later echo elsewhere in history, sometimes stripped of its meaning. In later courts, gold flake became a symbol of luxury, of elegance, even of artifice. But in these temple contexts, its purpose was steadier. It was not meant to decorate, but to channel. To move with gold upon the eyes was not simply beautiful. It was functional. If the function was divine attention, and gold was not the only substance used for such sacred adornment. In some cultures, mica was dusted onto skin for similar shimmer. Crushed shells, polished stones, even powdered crystals were used to catch particular angles of light. But gold was unique for its weightlessness. Its shimmer was soft, not sharp. It glowed, rather than sparkled. And that glow was what mattered most. Little of this survives in records. Temple dancers were rarely named in royal annals. Their tools were not preserved in treasure rooms, but traces remain. In devotional poetry, in the ruins of inner sanctums, and in residue samples lifted from ancient cosmetic jars. One such jar, found near a southern shrine, still contained a thin ring of gold sediment around its base. Analysis confirmed that the particles had been suspended in a blend of almond oil and saffron. The container itself was not ornate. Clay, simply fired, with a lid that fit snugly. Likely handled daily. Likely warmed between palms before each sunrise offering. We tend to think of gold as wealth, as permanence, as symbol, but in this older world, it was sometimes just dust, fleeting, weightless, rubbed into skin by quiet hands in a sacred room. And the effect? Not garish, not ostentatious, just a glint, here and there, as the sun caught the brow of a moving figure and carried that glint along the temple wall. A flicker, a breath of light. Perhaps that is why the dancers used it. Not to become visible, but to disappear into the ritual of the day. To let their presence serve as vessel. To guide, as the carved wall once said, not the eye, but the fire. So if you ever find yourself standing in an old temple courtyard, and the sun catches a carving just so, you might glimpse what they once shaped with powder and movement. Light that moves with purpose, shimmer with meaning, and gold that once spoke for gods. The eye decoration used to trap evil glares inside stone. Imagine a quiet morning in a desert temple, where the stone walls hold the first warmth of the rising sun. The air is still, heavy with the scent of oil, resin, and earth that clings to every carved surface. Beyond the columns, date palms sway slightly, and the sound of a distant bronze bell marks the passage of another ritual hour. Inside, a priestess leans toward a polished copper mirror. With slow, practiced movements, she dips a reed applicator into a jar of thick black kohl and begins to line her eyes. The color is deep, nearly reflective, pulling light inward. It traces the shape of her gaze with precision, not for beauty, not in the way we might understand it now, but as a shield, a symbol, a channel. In ancient temples across Egypt and parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, eye decoration was more than adornment. It was defense. The black pigment, often made from galena, a lead-based mineral, was believed to draw out and absorb harmful forces. Chief among them, the evil eye, or more specifically, envious glances from others, believed to carry with them a destructive energy. It's a concept that still lingers in many cultures today. The idea that a look alone, motivated by jealousy, resentment, or ill will, could cause misfortune. A child falling sick, a harvest failing, a lamp going out before its time. The ancients believed these glances carried weight, as though malice had a physical form. And so, they built their lives around ways to protect against it. The lined eyes of a priestess weren't simply symbolic. They were active conduits, designed to trap these invisible forces. The black ring around the eye didn't just ward off energy, it captured it. According to temple tradition, the envy absorbed through the priestess's gaze was then transferred, quietly, into the stones of the temple. Through ritual touch or whispered incantation, the energy was passed from body to building. But these temples were not passive vessels. The stone itself was considered alive in its own way. receptive to power, both divine and dangerous. When enough harmful force had been drawn in, the priestesses performed a sealing rite. These ceremonies weren't loud or dramatic. They were slow, measured, conducted at dawn or dusk, when the light shifted and shadows grew long. A wall, once filled with years of collected enmity, would be ritually anointed, whispered over, and finally sealed. Sometimes with plaster, sometimes with pigment, sometimes with simply a mark, often invisible to any outsider. The goal wasn't to destroy the trapped energy, but to contain it, keep it away from the sacred spaces, protect the worshippers, ensure the balance of power remained intact. We don't know the names of the priestesses who performed these tasks. Their records were rarely preserved in official inscriptions, but we find echoes of them in murals. Eyes rimmed in black, turned toward the horizon. We find the tools they used: stone palettes, tiny jars of pigment, reeds carved to a taper. And we find the walls themselves, still bearing traces of that coal-like mineral in their joints. In some places, modern archaeologists have noted unusual concentrations of lead compounds in corners or along thresholds, places where rituals may have occurred. In others, there are sealed chambers with no clear function, tucked between foundations. Not tombs, not storage. Perhaps simply places where unwanted forces were left behind. It's easy now to dismiss such things as superstition, but for the people who lived within these worlds, unseen forces were as real as wind. They shaped behavior, defined rituals, and governed trust. Protection wasn't a passive hope. It was a discipline, a practice, something learned over years, passed from elder to novice, each gesture as careful as the next. The role of the priestess, in this context, was as much about absorption as invocation. She stood between the sacred and the profane, between the envy of the outside world and the quiet power of the temple's inner sanctum. Her eyes became tools, her gaze a boundary. Daily life within the temple moved to a rhythm. Morning offerings, midday readings, evening lamplighting. Between these moments, the priestesses prepared incense, washed sacred vessels, tended to scrolls. And always, their faces remained lined. It wasn't a matter of choice or fashion. It was function, and outside the temple, others mirrored the practice. Mothers lined their children's eyes in soot. Fishermen darkened their gaze before casting nets, not because they believed themselves powerful, but because they feared the weight of attention, to be noticed, especially in times of scarcity or misfortune, was to invite danger. The gaze of others could carry not just admiration, but resentment, and with it, consequences. Even today, remnants of these beliefs echo faintly. Charms shaped like eyes, blue beads strung on doorways, phrases whispered to deflect compliments. They stem from a distant understanding that the eyes can both give and take. Imagine walking through one of those old temples now, the roof long gone, the floor dusted with centuries of sand. But the walls remain, silent and watchful. And if you look closely, you might still see traces of that dark pigment along the carvings. Marks made not for beauty, but for protection. And perhaps, within the cool shadow of a sealed alcove, something lingers. Not malevolent, not awake, just the soft residue of old envy, collected like dust in corners, held fast in stone by hands long gone. So much of ancient life was shaped by what could not be seen, and those who learned to navigate that world, who stood quietly in temples, black-ringed eyes watching, left behind no words, only walls, and silence, and stillness, and sometimes, that's all history needs. The lip tint that could only be made during lunar eclipse. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a temple courtyard, just as the moon begins to darken. The air is hushed, not from absence of sound, but from anticipation. Torches burn low, casting golden halos on stone. Above, the moon slips slowly into shadow, its familiar light swallowed by an ancient rhythm. A lunar eclipse has begun, and for a few watching figures in the shadows of the temple wall, this night marks the beginning of something far more precise. The making of a crimson stain, so rare it could only be born under this vanishing moon. This was not a cosmetic in the modern sense. The lip tint prepared on eclipse nights was part ritual, part mystery, and part medicine. Its recipe survives only in pieces, carved discreetly into temple niches or passed between initiates, line by line. It began with the ash of pomegranates, fruit already sacred to many cultures, symbolizing fertility, cycles, and blood. The pomegranates had to be picked just before full ripening, their skins dark, their seeds still tight. They were dried until brittle, then burned slowly to powder beneath a fire prepared only with fig and olive wood. But it was not just the ingredients that mattered. It was the timing. The ash could only be blended into base oils or tinctures while the eclipse was in full effect. In those few hours when the moon turned red and then disappeared entirely, practitioners worked in silence, guided by torchlight and memory. The substance was stirred with copper rods, never iron, and left to ferment in small sealed jars lined with beeswax. What emerged after cooling was a thick stain, deep crimson, dark as wine in shadow. When touched to the lips, it left not only color but sensation. A slow tingling, a warmth. Those who wore it during rituals described the onset of trance-like states. Slower breath, elongated silence, a sense of drifting just beyond the boundary of the self. It was not applied daily, nor lightly. The tint was reserved for specific rites, solstice prayers, funerary processions, or temple invocations. In some accounts, priestesses wore it to speak between the worlds. Not to the dead, exactly, but to that which passed between dusk and dream. And it was not only women. Some male initiates, especially those in the oracle traditions, used the tint as part of their preparation to receive visions. Combined with fasting and incense, it was said to open the gates of inner sight, not through clarity, but through color. The carving that survives, hidden along the edge of a temple column later buried in sand, speaks not of beauty, but of boundary. To where the eclipse is to speak in blood, it reads, to stain the mouth is to unbind the tongue from time. What exactly this means is uncertain, but perhaps that was the point. The recipe, like the eclipse, was not designed for ordinary use. Over time, the ritual fell out of practice. Eclipses came and went, but fewer hands remembered the preparation. The fermentation failed without the proper timing. The pomegranate trees declined, and slowly the knowledge faded. Later cultures would remember only the fragments. That certain fruits were sacred, that red lips marked rites of passage, that the moon could change more than the sky. Some whisper that a handful of jars still remain, hidden deep in crypts or sealed behind temple walls. Not for use, but for preservation, a memory in red. There is something gentle in the idea that a color, just a color, could carry so much intention, that the act of applying it was never simply adornment, but alignment. That under the vanishing moon, people gathered to grind, mix, and prepare. Not just for beauty, but to walk more closely with the hidden layers of the world. Imagine one such night. A figure seated cross-legged in a stone chamber. The eclipse has peaked, and outside the crowd murmurs in awe, watching the moon darken. But here, in the stillness, the lip tint is touched to the mouth. The breath slows. A bowl of burning myrrh fills the air with a smoky sweetness. The eyes close, and the red, once part of fruit, now part of ash, carries the mind somewhere else entirely. Sleep now with that thought. That long ago, when the sky changed color, people below changed with it. And in the brief darkness of a shadowed moon, even something as small as a lip tint could become a doorway. The blue-eye dust used to call down rain in the dry season. Imagine a dry season so long that even the riverbed has begun to crack. The soil is brittle, pale, and powder-soft underfoot. Crops falter in the fields, and animals graze over dust where grass once grew. In the village square, jars once used to catch runoff sit empty beneath a cloudless sky. No clouds, no wind, only stillness, and the quiet pressure of waiting. In times like this, the people turn to older practices, not the scheduled prayers of the calendar, but rituals remembered by the eldest priests, performed only when the air itself seemed to beg for water. And central to these rituals was a rare deep blue pigment, powdered lapis lazuli. This stone, carried from distant mountains, was not common. It arrived in small pieces, wrapped in wool or linen, and was kept in the innermost rooms of temples, alongside other sacred materials: gold leaf, incense, and scrolls sealed with wax. To use lapis for anything but divine purposes would have been unthinkable. It was not for art or decoration, but for invocation. When drought gripped the land and weeks passed without rain, the temple gates would open before dawn. Women gathered at the river's edge to offer what water they could spare, poured slowly onto the parched ground. Meanwhile, within the temple, a ritual began. It was known by several names, though most roughly translate to the calling of water with the inner eye. Only select priests and, in some cases, priestesses took part. Their faces were washed with cold water drawn from the deepest well, then anointed with oil steeped in blue lotus. Over their closed eyelids, lapis powder was dusted carefully, using soft brushes made of reed fiber. The effect was vivid. Luminous streaks of blue curved from temple to nose bridge, glinting as if the very sky had settled on their faces. But it was not about appearance. The pigment was believed to change what the eye could perceive. Not the outer world, but the world within. It was thought that when one entered trance with blue upon the eyes, they would become mirrors, not reflecting themselves, but channeling images from the divine realm. And if the gods saw their own world reflected in human eyes, lush, misted, abundant, perhaps they would release rain into this one. Participants sat in rows facing the altar, hands placed lightly over their hearts. The chamber was dark, but not silent. Temple musicians played long, slow chords on harps and flutes tuned to echo the rhythm of water, steady, low, and rippling. Incense made of dried juniper and tamarisk was burned, curling into the air like phantom mist. As the ritual progressed, those seated entered trance states. Not sleep, not dream, but something in between. Their breathing slowed, their bodies stilled, and slowly visions came, or were imagined. Blue light flickering, rivers breaking through dry stone, clouds gathering, thick with meaning. In some cases, witnesses described seeing tears form in the corners of the painted eyes, not from sadness, but from the visions pressing outward. After the ritual ended, often hours later, the participants remained silent. A record was made not of their words, but of what the attending priests observed. Small stone tablets found centuries later bear curious inscriptions. Eyes of the fifth bore images of falling water across reeds, or the elder's right eye held clouds shaped like hands. These were not meant as poetry. They were taken seriously, as signs that the divine had heard. Sometimes, within a day or two, rain did come, a light mist at first, enough to stir the surface of the earth. Other times, nothing followed. The ritual would be repeated, or not, depending on what the visions revealed. But the practice continued, not because it always succeeded, but because it brought a kind of order to desperation, a rhythm, a structure to the pleading. Over time, lapis became associated not just with rain, but with sacred insight. Tomb paintings show figures wearing blue only around the eyes. Later texts refer to the pigment as sky dust. In certain households, a tiny shard of lapis was kept above the doorframe, not for wealth, but in case the drought returned. There are some modern scholars who argue that the pigment finely ground may have had mild psychoactive effects when absorbed through the skin, especially when paired with ritual fasting or aromatic oils. Others note that simply focusing inward in the cool darkness of a temple could produce a meditative calm strong enough to induce vision. Still others believe it was the music, the repetition, the suggestion, all combining to shape what was seen behind the eyes. Regardless of the mechanism, what mattered was what the people believed. That the blue did not just color the body, but invited the sky to look back. The chambers where these rituals took place are mostly ruined now. Roofs caved in, pigment bowls scattered, inscriptions worn nearly smooth. But if you were to sit in such a space and close your own eyes, you might still imagine it. The hum of breath, the scent of juniper, the soft brush against your face. And in the distance, a sound like falling water, just beginning to return. And above all, the sky, endlessly blue, waiting to answer. The cosmetics that could only be stored in crocodile jars. Imagine yourself in a quiet chamber lit by oil lamps, deep within the walls of an ancient temple town. The air is thick with the scent of crushed herbs, old linen, and ground minerals. Shelves line the walls, clay, alabaster, and stone containers neatly arranged. Their lids carved into shapes that seem halfway between animal and god. And among them, always placed apart, sit a handful of low, thick jars with wide-toothed lids. They are shaped like crocodiles, rounded, stylized, mouths open just enough to suggest menace. These are not decorations. These are guardians. Inside, there is something small and soft. A smear of pigment, rich in color and sharp in scent. A protective cosmetic, worn not for beauty alone, but as a barrier between skin and spirit. Ancient instructions are clear. This type of salve must only be kept in crocodile-shaped jars. Not because of superstition, exactly, but because of function. As one inscription along the tomb wall put it, "The jar bites the spirit that would flee. The mouth is its prison." To modern eyes, this might sound poetic, but to those who lived under the sun-drenched skies of the Nile Valley, it was practical magic. The idea was simple. Protective pigments were not passive. They absorbed danger, and anything that gathered negative energy might release it if left unguarded. Crocodile jars solved this problem by trapping the forces within, snapping their wide, toothy lids shut on anything that tried to escape. The cosmetics in question weren't ordinary rouge or eyeliner. These were compounds made specifically for healing and warding off illness. They might be worn beneath the eyes to repel glare and evil influence, or daubed across the temples to ease headaches and spiritual unrest. Their recipes were recorded in temple scrolls and passed down through priestly lines. Galena mixed with goose fat, or crushed malachite blended with bitter herbs. Applied carefully by hand, often by those trained in ritual as well as medicine, these pigments were said to guard the vulnerable, especially children, the pregnant, and the sick. And when not in use, they had to be kept sealed, not in ordinary pots, but in ones imbued with the right protective presence. And nothing, in this regard, was more fearsome or respected than the crocodile. To ancient Egyptians, the crocodile was not just a creature of the river. It was a god's avatar. Sobek, lord of the waters, embodiment of strength, fertility, and ferocity, was often depicted with a crocodile head, his gaze calm, his teeth sharp. He controlled floods, protected the pharaoh's body, and struck terror into spirits that might harm the living. His likeness, carved into jars, became a watchman in miniature, always ready to bite. These jars were typically low and rounded, shaped to resemble a crocodile's belly. Their lids were carved in relief. Open jaws or scaly heads, sometimes with painted eyes still visible across the centuries. A few even had articulated jaws that would gently snap shut when pressed. A small theatrical detail that likely delighted or unsettled those who used them. They were not mass-produced. Only households of means, or those with ties to temple healers could afford such jars. In burial chambers, they're often found near amulets and salves, clustered near the body or tucked inside wooden boxes beside letters to the gods. And while many cosmetics were stored in plain bowls or alabaster jars, only the most potent, those used in ritual anointing or spiritual defense, rested beneath the crocodile's watchful gaze. One surviving inscription, found near a priestess's tomb in Middle Egypt, reads, "This salve binds the eye against sorrow. Keep it beneath the crocodile's mouth, for sorrow is a thing that writhes and runs." The jar, remarkably intact, still bore traces of black pigment around the rim, evidence of use or of a final application before burial. These beliefs weren't based on fear alone. They reflected a view of the world where everything seen and unseen was active, where cosmetics, oils, and scents had agency. They could draw good fortune or misfortune. They could open a person to divine favor or make them vulnerable to unseen decay. And so, protective measures were layered. The pigment guarded the body. The jar guarded the pigment. And so it continued, year after year, generation after generation. The jars remained on shelves behind curtains beside altars. Their mouths gaped silently, offering reassurance in the dark. Their lids were removed only with reverence, then quickly replaced. And when a user passed on, the jar was often buried with them, sealed and undisturbed, its final contents never meant to be used again. In time, the jars fell out of use. Trade changed. Belief systems shifted. Crocodiles, once gods, became curiosities. And yet, some of these jars remain. Unearthed from dusty storerooms or hidden niches, their lids still fitting tightly, their carved jaws chipped but recognizable. One sits today in a museum case, labeled simply cosmetic container. But those who look closely will see the old intention carved into its face. The slight tilt of the eyes, the implied snap of the jaw, a quiet threat to any spirit still lingering near the contents within. As you drift now into rest, let your thoughts linger there. In that chamber lit by flame, the shelves lined with silence, the crocodile jars keeping watch. They do not sleep. They do not speak. But their mouths remain open, as if still guarding something that once mattered deeply. A smear of pigment, a whisper of protection, a bite too small to hear, but never quite forgotten. The powder that caused prophets to dream in foreign tongues. Imagine a stone chamber lit not by fire, but by moonlight falling through a narrow window carved high into the eastern wall. The light shifts slowly across polished floor tiles, its journey tracked not by clocks, but by memory. On a low table rests a bowl made of dark stone, its contents pale and faintly glimmering. A fine white powder, lighter than flour, soft as sifted ash. This was no ordinary cosmetic. It was not worn for beauty or ceremony. It was applied only in silence, and only before sleep, across the temples of a forgotten sect, whose name is preserved only in fragments. This powder was known as a gate. Its use was reserved for dream prophets, figures selected not for their lineage, but for their sensitivity. Before a dream ritual, they would wash in cold water, don linen robes, and enter the silence of the inner room. There, another figure, part attendant, part scribe, would mix the powder with a drop of oil and smooth it gently across the face. Forehead, temples, the ridge of the nose, the hollow below the lip. Then the prophet would lie down, hands folded, eyes closed, the scent of crushed herbs lingering in the air. And they would wait, not for sleep, but for something deeper. The records we have are fragmentary, scratched into stone, painted onto faded plaster, or buried inside more practical temple logs. But they speak of a strange consistency. Those who wore the powder began to speak in their dreams, not in their native tongue, but in languages unknown to them. Sometimes it was a flurry of strange syllables, sometimes a single word, repeated again and again. The scribes were trained not to interpret, but to copy. They wrote phonetically, listening carefully and carving the sounds into clay or onto prepared bark. Years later, when these tablets were rediscovered, the words were matched, sometimes imperfectly, to dialects long thought dead: Aramaic, Proto-Elamite, fragments of Old Sumerian, even tongues that remain untranslated today. The powder was not named in the records. It was never described in detail, only that it was of the color that quiets thought, and that it softened the veil. Some believed it came from powdered bone. Others suggested crushed flowers, or chalk drawn from a particular hill where no birds nested. No definitive recipe survives. What mattered to them was not what it was made of, but what it allowed. In these dream rituals, the prophets did not interpret what they saw. They merely spoke what came. Their utterances were considered raw material, divine fragments, to be shaped by the high scribes and priest historians. But the prophets themselves were not always revered. In fact, many were treated with distance. They fasted often. They slept alone. They rarely lived long. Their faces, over time, grew pale, perhaps from repeated application of the powder, or perhaps from something deeper. Their eyes were said to shift in color under certain phases of the moon. But again, these may be only the descriptions passed down by others, by those who did not dream in strange tongues. Imagine, for a moment, the ritual chamber just before one of these sessions. A brazier burns low in the corner, emitting a thin smoke. The scribe waits beside the sleeping mat, stylus ready. The prophet reclines, the powder freshly applied, the face pale under its coating. A silence holds, not tense, but expectant. Then a breath. Then a sound, like a murmur rising from a deep well. Then language, not random, not babble, not the prophet's own speech, but something older, rounder, spoken with strange cadences as though remembered from another lifetime. Sometimes, the phrases were gentle. Other times, they became urgent, rising in tempo before ending in sudden quiet. And the scribe, unmoved, simply recorded. Later, these words were carved into temple walls, not in the main halls, but in smaller alcoves, places where light barely reached. They were not sermons, not prayers, just echoes. It was believed that some divine truths came not in fire or vision, but in foreign grammar. The logic of gods, they said, was not bound to familiar tongues. The powder itself was stored carefully. Containers have been found, small, round jars of black clay, sealed with wax and bearing cryptic marks. Some contain faint traces of white residue, though modern testing has failed to identify anything remarkable. No poisons, no hallucinogens, no clear cause, and yet the practice endured for centuries. A faith not in the substance, but in the pattern. In later periods, copies of the dream utterances were stored in temple libraries, cross-referenced with known languages, treated almost like dictionaries of divine speech. Scholars debated whether the dreams came from the gods, from ancestors, or from something older than either. One theory, written in the margin of a 12th century copy, suggested this. The powder does not give voice, it removes noise. And what remains is not the dreamer, but the world before speech. The rituals faded eventually. Perhaps the powder recipe was lost. Perhaps new kings no longer trusted dreamers. Perhaps the gods themselves went silent. The chambers were sealed, the jars buried, the scribes reassigned to more practical duties, tracking grain, copying royal decrees. But still, on the inner wall of one temple ruin, a phrase survives. Not in the local tongue, not translated, just a line carved in steady hand. Before I woke, the wind spoke in a voice I once knew. No one knows who spoke it, or what it meant, but the carving is smooth, deliberate, meant to last. And so it has. the scented ointment used to bind spoken prayers to skin. Imagine a morning before the sun has cleared the horizon, when the world is still silver with dew, and the temples lie in a hush broken only by the rustle of linen and the whisper of footsteps across polished stone. Within one such sanctuary, deep in the heart of an ancient city where incense smoke curls upward in long, lazy tendrils, a quiet ritual begins. A priest stands before a low altar, its surface warmed by oil lamps and dusted with crushed resin. The air is thick with scent, an aromatic mix of frankincense, myrrh, and ground herbs stored in small alabaster jars. In this quiet chamber, prayers are not shouted or sung. They are spoken low and slow, each word shaped as carefully as a sculptor turns stone. And these words, it was believed, could be bound, fused, even, into the skin itself. This was no metaphor. The ritual used a cosmetic balm, thick, rich, and fragrant, that would be applied to the skin in deliberate spirals. Not rubbed or smeared, but carefully traced in circular motion along the arms, beginning near the shoulders and winding slowly downward. It wasn't done quickly. The process could take hours, and during each motion, the priest would speak sacred phrases, not aloud to the air, but directly toward the skin, as if the body itself were a scroll receiving ink. The balm itself was made from a base of animal fat or plant oil, infused with crushed frankincense, known in many ancient cultures not just for its pleasing scent, but for its perceived spiritual properties. Frankincense was thought to open the senses, to soften the barrier between the material world and the divine, to carry prayers upward. But in this case, the goal was not ascent, but embedding. By speaking holy words while applying the ointment, priests believed the sound would imprint onto the flesh itself. The skin, warmed by oil and opened by scent, was seen as receptive, able to absorb not just the balm, but the intention behind the words. It was a kind of living inscription. These weren't random prayers. They were chosen based on the needs of the ritual. Protection, healing, strength, endurance. Sometimes they were blessings, other times they were warnings. Phrases meant to keep evil at bay, to ward off illness, misfortune, or envy. And once applied, the ointment was left undisturbed for the day. Washing it off too soon might wash away the prayer itself. Wall reliefs in some temples depict this act in stylized form. Figures with arms raised, priests bending over them with small vessels in hand. Spirals carved faintly into the stone show the path of the balm. These scenes are often tucked away, near preparation rooms or in corners not meant for public display. This was not a spectacle. It was personal, quiet, and layered in meaning. The spiral itself held significance. In many ancient belief systems, the spiral represented continuity, something without beginning or end, a symbol of cycles, breath, and renewal. By tracing a spiral, the priest was not just marking the body with fragrance, but with intention. The direction of the spiral mattered. Clockwise for blessings, counterclockwise for banishment. What's remarkable is the way the human body was understood not simply as a vessel, but as a surface, capable of being written on, transformed, imbued. And yet, unlike tattoos or scarification, this method left no visible mark once the balm faded. The writing was believed to be spiritual, not literal, internal rather than external. But just as binding, in times of drought, such ointments might carry prayers for rain. In times of war, they might carry words of courage. For travelers, protection. For rulers, clarity. And for the priests themselves, who walk the line between sacred and mortal, a reminder of the words they had sworn to live by. Modern science, of course, doesn't affirm that sound can be trapped in skin, but the ancient mind didn't require such proof. To them, words had weight, breath had power, and the body was more than muscle and bone. It was a landscape where the divine could rest, if invited properly. These ointments were prepared with care. The ingredients, resins, oils, herbs, were measured not just by volume, but by time and place. Frankincense harvested at dawn was considered different from that gathered at dusk. Oils pressed under a full moon carried separate properties than those prepared under a new one. Nothing was casual. Even the storage vessels mattered. Some balms were kept in black stone jars, sealed with wax, marked with tiny inscriptions that faded over time but were never truly erased. These jars were placed in cool rooms beneath the temple and only opened during ceremony. And once the balm was applied, the person who received it carried the prayer with them, whether or not they believed it mattered, whether or not they spoke aloud. The act of having it done was thought to change them, to shield them, even if only briefly, from the chaos of the world. You might imagine someone walking home from the temple, the scent of the ointment rising softly from their skin in the heat of the day. They pass through markets, through dust, through shadow, and though nothing appears different, they feel changed, watched over, tethered gently to something greater than themselves. And perhaps that's what mattered most. Not the permanence of the balm, but the memory of the moment, the calm voice of the priest, the warmth of the oil, the spiral traced with care. So much of ancient ritual centered not on proving, but on feeling, on texture, rhythm, and scent. A sensory memory that, even after the balm had faded, lingered in the mind like a song remembered only in fragments. Today, these traditions are largely lost, but echoes remain in scented oils used for meditation, in the careful placement of fingers during a blessing, in the unspoken belief that touch, when combined with intention, carries power. And if you ever walk the halls of a museum and see a carved figure with spirals on its arms, or a stone jar still faintly stained with resin, know that you're looking at the remnants of a prayer once whispered not to the sky, but to the skin. A moment where words met flesh and were asked to stay. The blue-green Kohl that let the dead recognize the living. Imagine yourself inside the dim interior of an ancient temple. The air is cool and heavy with the scent of incense, faintly metallic, with a hint of crushed resin. The walls rise around you in warm, worn stone, covered in painted scenes that have endured centuries. And everywhere you look, the eyes are lined, not only of gods and pharaohs, but of ordinary men and women. Their faces are adorned with twin bands of color, blue above, green below. Twin shades, still vivid after lifetimes. This was more than art. In certain rites, especially those performed at dawn within temples that face the rising sun, participants would line their eyes with a very specific kind of dual Kohl. One hue, malachite green, was drawn along the lower lid. Another, a deep blue derived from ground azurite or lapis lazuli, traced the upper. This blue-green combination was not worn for beauty or status. It was worn so the dead could see who stood before them. According to inscriptions found within family tombs and ritual chambers, this was a lineage marker, a sign, softly spoken through pigment, that the living still remembered the names of the dead. It was believed that when prayers were offered and names of ancestors read aloud, the spirits gathered nearby. But the spirit realm did not see as the living did. Forms were fluid, features forgotten. What endured was color, pattern, and intention. So the blue and green Kohl became a kind of visual signature. Tomb walls contain evidence of this belief. In certain necropolis chapels, painted portraits, done not in strict realism, but in symbolic tones, show generations of faces wearing the same mirrored pigments. Beneath each is a family name, inscribed with care. Some include short phrases, so that the eye may know, or let the ancestors remember. It wasn't universal. Only some families practiced this, but where it occurred, it was taken seriously. The pigments themselves were prepared with ceremony. Malachite was imported or mined locally, then ground into a fine, soft powder. Its green vivid and cool. Azurite, rarer and more costly, required more care. Both were mixed with fats or resin-based oils, sometimes infused with cedar or myrrh. The applicators, made of ivory, bronze, or hollow reeds, were stored in long, narrow boxes, often buried alongside the wearers. Before ritual, the pigments were applied in silence. The blue on top symbolized clarity, vision, and the sky, sometimes associated with the god Horus, whose eye was protective and sharp. The green below represented renewal, the earth, and the god Osiris, keeper of the underworld and patron of the dead. Together, the two colors formed a kind of balance. One for sight, one for memory. There was a belief that when descendants stood before their ancestors' images, wearing these dual tones, the spirits would recognize the bond, not by name alone, but by the pattern around the eyes. Just as a child knows the face of a parent not through features alone, but through repetition, these pigment rituals made the living familiar to the dead. And in a world where family names were spoken to maintain the soul's presence in the afterlife, that recognition mattered. Later, when archaeologists unearthed some of these tombs, they found jars with dried remnants of pigment and long-handled applicators placed beside written prayers. Some of those jars had lids still sealed with wax, as though awaiting one final use. In a few especially well-preserved chambers, they found wall panels where the pigments still shimmered faintly. Time had softened their edges, but not their meaning. Faces looked out with lined eyes, watchful. Names below them connected parent to child, cousin to cousin, generation to generation. And though the language of belief has changed, the impulse is familiar. Even now, people wear certain clothing at funerals, carry lockets with photographs, place candles in windows for those no longer seen. The desire to be known by the past, to be recognized by those who came before, is a quiet, enduring part of the human story. In ancient Egypt, that desire took form in color. In a gentle ritual repeated at sunrise, before the images of ancestors, a line of green and a line of blue helped bridge the invisible gap between this world and the next. So picture, if you like, the stillness of a temple corridor before dawn. A small family, perhaps a mother, her two daughters, a son, arrives quietly, each bearing a small mirror and a box of pigment. They take their time. The lines are drawn slowly, with respect. No need for words. When the sun's first light reaches the inner chamber, they stand before the painted walls. Names are spoken softly, and they wait, not for reply, but for recognition. Sleep now with that image, that once, long ago, the dead may have looked out through the veil of the unseen, and, by the shimmer of green and blue around the eyes, known exactly who had come to visit. The healer's paint used to transfer illness to sacred statues. Imagine yourself standing in a chamber carved from cool, pale stone, lit not by flame, but by soft daylight filtering through a narrow shaft above. The air is quiet, dense with a scent of crushed herbs and distant incense. Smooth walls bear lines of inscriptions, faint but deliberate, etched by hand, preserved for centuries. And near the far end of the room sits a statue, serene, unblinking, eyes closed in timeless stillness. This is not a temple in the usual sense. It is a healing sanctuary, neither private home nor public shrine, but a place where body, spirit, and ritual intertwined. In these chambers, the line between medicine and devotion blurred, and physicians, those trained not only in poultices and bandages, but in rites, practiced one of the most curious and intimate forms of healing known to the ancient world: the transfer of illness through pigment. The core belief was simple, though the practice was anything but. Sickness, they thought, was not only physical, it could cling to the spirit, attach itself to the shadow of the person. To remove it, one could not simply treat the body. One had to convince the ailment to move. And to do this, the healer turned to paint. A mixture was prepared from ground minerals and plant extracts. Red ochre for warmth, white chalk for purity, yellow from dried safflower, believed to draw imbalance outward. These pigments were mixed with oil or water, sometimes wine, depending on the condition. Each hue had purpose, not for beauty, but for its symbolic role in the transfer of ailment. The patient was brought in gently, often after days of preparation, dietary restriction, cleansing, silence. They sat or lay before the effigy, which was often of a local healing deity. A lion-faced protector, a motherly figure with outstretched hands, or a calm scribe-like god holding a scroll. The physician would apply pigment first to the patient's face, across the forehead, down the cheeks, sometimes over the chest or hands. These strokes were made in silence, each line forming part of a path, guiding the sickness out. Then, the same pigment was applied to the statue in the exact same pattern. Not imitation, but transference. The belief was that the illness, now represented in color, would be drawn into the divine image, which could contain and neutralize it without harm. Then came the washing. A fine cloth, soaked in scented water, often infused with cedar or myrtle, was used to gently wipe the pigment from the statue. Not scrubbed, not erased, but lifted away with care. The cloth, now stained, was placed in a sealed vessel, sometimes burned, sometimes buried in sacred ground, depending on the instructions etched into the sanctuary wall. These instructions remain today. Fragments of them, at least. One reads, "Begin with red for fever, yellow for the bile, white when the breath shortens. Match each line. Do not speak. Let the water carry it away." Another, "If the statue weeps, do not fear. The god accepts the weight." Not all sessions resulted in recovery. Illness, then as now, did not always yield. But even when the body remained unhealed, many reported feeling lighter, calmer, as though something had indeed been taken away. If not the sickness itself, then the burden of isolation that often came with it. Because illness in the ancient world was more than a private experience. It marked the body in ways others could see. It changed one's place in society, created fear, suspicion, distance. The act of this ritual, of being seen, painted, mirrored, and gently cleansed, restored not just health, but dignity. It returned the patient to the web of the living. Interestingly, these rituals were performed not only by priests, but by specialized healers who trained for years. They studied both plant medicine and sacred texts. They learned how to read pulse, how to mix pigments, how to interpret dreams that might follow the ritual. Some sanctuaries even kept dream tablets, where patients recorded what they saw the night after the ceremony. A bird flying west, a river running backward, a figure placing their hands on the heart. Each image was studied for meaning, for progress, for whether the illness had moved. The statues used in these rituals were never destroyed. They were cleaned, reconsecrated, and used again, but they were treated with great care, and in some records, replaced after a certain number of rituals. The vessel, one inscription reads, must not be overburdened. When its shade darkens, offer a new image. Today, we can still find traces of this practice in healing shrines long buried beneath sand and ash. Statues with faint pigment residue in the corners of the eyes. Shallow basins near their feet, stained with mineral streaks. Shelves carved into the wall, just large enough for a small mixing bowl and brush. The silence of those spaces is heavy, as though still listening. It is tempting to dismiss the ritual as symbolic. And in many ways, it was. But symbolism, in those times, was not a substitute for medicine. It was medicine, to be touched with care, to be mirrored by a figure believed to be divine, to feel the illness externalized and then removed. These were not mere comforts. They were acts of restoration, of realignment, of belief made tangible through pigment and gesture. And as strange as it may seem, the idea remains with us still. The use of color to soothe. the symbolic power of cleansing, the mirror as a tool for transformation, the notion that healing is not only chemical, but ritual, something that moves through the hands, the eyes, the breath. So if you ever find yourself standing in one of these chambers, carved deep into stone, try to imagine the scene as it once was. A quiet room, a steady hand, the glint of colored paint beneath the eye. And beside it, a statue, not watching but receiving, holding something that could not be named, then letting it go. The ritual compact hidden in tomb walls to ward off betrayal. Imagine yourself in a burial chamber where everything is still, where centuries of dust have settled like velvet, and the walls whisper in symbols rather than sound. You're standing before a smooth stone panel, cool to the touch, carved not with scenes of conquest or glory, but with delicate, deliberate lines. Among them, a box. Not large, not ornate. Just a compact square, outlined by an incised border, nearly flush with the wall. You wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it. But beneath the glyphs, the inscription reads, "This mirror box shall not open unless blood betrays blood. Then let it see." In ancient tombs, much was buried with the dead, amulets, tools, offerings. But this was different. It wasn't placed near the body, nor nestled among jewelry. It was sealed behind the very stone of the tomb structure, almost as if to hide it from the living and the dead alike. The box itself, when finally uncovered thousands of years later, contained no glass, no jewels, only two things: a hardened cluster of red pigment and a darkened, polished piece of obsidian. This was no cosmetic item. It was a ritual compact, a symbolic object shaped like a makeup case, but serving an entirely different purpose. It had been placed not to decorate, but to watch. The woman buried in that tomb was likely of high status. Her name, partly eroded, remains in fragments. What is intact are the prayers carved near the compact's chamber. They speak of loyalty, protection, and, most curiously, betrayal. Not betrayal she committed, but betrayal that might come after her. The kind passed down through generations. A bloodline split by deceit. This idea, that betrayal could echo across time and disturb the peace of the dead, was not uncommon in the ancient world. In Egyptian belief, harmony, or ma'at, was not just a moral state, but a cosmic one. To betray family, to dishonor oaths, was to unbalance the scales not just in life, but in death. And so, precautions were taken. The compact, shaped like a cosmetic case, drew on familiar forms. In daily life, mirror boxes were tools of adornment, self-reflection, and intimate routine. But in ritual form, they became something else entirely. The reflective surface, often obsidian or polished copper, was not meant to show beauty, but to reveal truth. And the pigment, a dried red paste, was likely symbolic of judgment, life force, or divine wrath. Together, they formed a kind of spiritual surveillance, a quiet object set to wait. The inscriptions around the box were clear but calm. Let the mirror sleep. Let it stay closed unless the line is broken. If the oath is severed, let it see. Let it judge. Let it awaken. No curses, no dramatic threats, just a measured warning. A mechanism of balance. We can imagine how this might have been understood at the time. Perhaps a betrayal had occurred in the woman's life, an inheritance contested, a family feud unresolved. Or perhaps it was fear alone, a desire to protect her descendants from one another. Whatever the cause, this box was her safeguard. Not for her body, but for her name. The compact itself was a marvel of craftsmanship. Carved from limestone with inlaid pigment grooves, its lid was sealed with a faint resin. The interior held the obsidian square nestled into a curved recess, beneath which rested the dried red substance. Its exact composition is still debated. Likely a mix of ochre, gum resin, and some organic binder. What matters is not its color, but its placement. Behind the wall, unseen, yet fully prepared. Such protective tools were not entirely rare, though few were as deliberately hidden. Texts from the New Kingdom and late periods speak of objects that sleep, artifacts meant to activate only under certain spiritual conditions. Some were set to awaken if the tomb was disturbed. Others, like this one, responded not to place, but to people, to betrayal, named explicitly. The language of bloodline was deeply significant in this context. Family ties were sacred in Egyptian culture, not just socially, but cosmically. Your ancestors could help or hinder your passage into the afterlife. Your descendants could preserve your memory or erase it. Betrayal within a family was seen as doubly dangerous. It threatened the living and the eternal. And so, the mirror box was placed not among gold or linen, but inside the wall. Silent, waiting. What it was meant to do, should betrayal occur, is harder to say. There are no instructions to open it. No rites of activation. Only the assumption that it would see. Perhaps metaphorically, perhaps not. In one interpretation, the mirror would reflect guilt back onto the betrayer. In another, it would summon unrest in the tomb, stirring the spirit until justice was restored. And in yet another, it would simply witness, ensuring that even if justice was not found in life, it would be seen in the world beyond. The archaeological discovery of the box created debate. Some dismissed it as symbolic, a psychological safeguard, like a locked diary. Others insisted it was more than that. A spiritual mechanism tied to old priestly rites, now lost. Still others pointed to its placement, precision, and inscriptions as proof of intentionality far deeper than decoration. Whatever the case, it remained sealed for millennia, and when it was finally opened, carefully, under museum lights, it released no dust, no spirit, no curse. Only silence. The pigment had dried, the obsidian dulled with time, but the message lingered. Now, imagine again the chamber, just before the wall was closed. A priest presses the box into place. The stone is fitted over it. The carvings traced one final time. Then darkness. Not emptiness. Just silence. Waiting. You can feel it now. Not fear, not warning, but wait. The sense of something old. Not malicious, but alert. A promise, perhaps. A shield shaped like a mirror, buried so that it might never be needed. Let that image remain with you. A quiet box in the wall. A name protected by stone. And a lineage watched over not by gods, but by the reflection of their own choices. As your thoughts drift into sleep, let the compact close once again in your mind. The pigment undisturbed. The mirror untouched. The promise still sealed behind time. The mask-like powder used to channel animal guardians. Imagine yourself in the cool interior of a stone temple, the kind where footsteps echo even when walked in silence. The light here does not pour in. It drips slowly through small openings carved near the ceiling, diffused by incense smoke that hangs like breath waiting to be exhaled. Somewhere nearby, water trickles through a carved channel. A drum beats slowly, steady as a heartbeat, and before a polished copper mirror, a figure leans in as another gently presses thick powder onto their face. Not lightly brushed on, not hidden, but applied in bold, deliberate patterns. Pale white for the jackal, ochre red for the lion, a curved line in black to lengthen the brow like a falcon's gaze. This was not decoration. This was invocation. The temples of this forgotten order, whose remnants still appear in fragments across Egypt, Nubia, and parts of Levant, practiced a rite that fused the human body with the guardians of their world. Animal forms were not costumes. They were access points. The powders used in these rituals weren't cosmetics in the modern sense, but ritual pigments, fine-ground minerals, ochres, charcoal, and chalk blended with oils or resins to bind them to skin. When applied in ceremony, these pigments did more than color. They created a mask. But the purpose of the mask was not to hide. It was to reveal. In many ancient belief systems, the boundary between human and animal was thinner than we imagine today. Animals were not lesser, not symbols, but participants in divine order. A jackal did not represent death. It understood it. A falcon did not stand for vision. It possessed it. To wear their likeness was to welcome their perspective. Temple walls depict this not as art, but as instruction. Midway through a ritual, the face of the participant begins to shift, recorded not through transformation, but through depiction. A human figure marked with a rising curve of a falcon's beak, eyes rimmed in kohl that extends upward, mimicking the alert gaze of the hawk. In another image, a wide jaw, painted with heavy black along the cheekbones, evokes the profile of a lion. The powders were thick. They dried into soft masks. Participants did not speak during the application. Silence was part of the rite. Only the attending priest, or sometimes priestess, could chant softly as they worked, tracing each feature with reverent fingers. The shapes drawn were not creative. They followed fixed lines, passed down through memory and chant. Each form had its own rhythm. The jackal mask, applied to those seeking to commune with the dead or to guide souls safely. The lion form, worn during times of protection or in ceremonies seeking strength. The falcon, the most common, invoked vision, clarity, and speed of divine understanding. The transformation was not only visual. The body followed. Each mask came with postures, movements, gestures, to where the lion's face was to lower the shoulders, to broaden the stance, to walk with the unhurried certainty of a predator, to where the falcon's mask was to narrow the eyes, to move in short, exact steps, to raise the head as though scanning a vast plain. Participants were not possessed exactly, but they entered a space between. The temple language calls it becoming the mouth of the watcher. That is, speaking as one seen through, not seen as. The spirit of the animal did not replace them. It echoed through them. It was believed that within this state, divine insight might come, not as commands or visions, but as impressions, feelings, a sudden knowledge that had not existed moments earlier. Sometimes the participants would speak, slowly, measured, often in ways that puzzled the listeners, only to gain meaning days later. And always, at the close of the rite, the mask would be washed away in silence. The powders themselves were carefully stored. Small stone jars, sealed with beeswax or clay, sat within shadowed alcoves of the preparation rooms. Recipes were rarely written. The black for the jackal often came from burnt almond shells. The red for the lion from iron-rich soil mixed with crushed seed. White chalk was softened with oil pressed from lotus seeds. What mattered was not the intensity of color, but the texture. It had to sit on the skin like a second face, yet crack slowly as time passed, to remind both the wearer and the watchers that transformation was not permanent. A face must return to its origin. Little of this is preserved outside temple walls. Many of the pigments faded over centuries, but close inspection shows faint outlines, curved lines on stone cheeks, animal profiles inscribed beside human names. Some walls even show half-masks, figures in mid-ritual, a falcon's beak just beginning to form. Scholars have debated whether these rites were theatrical, spiritual, or medicinal. Some call it proto-psychological, others ritual mimicry, but the records closest to the practice never define it at all. They treat it as known, expected, part of the structure of understanding, and in one temple fragment, damaged, half-buried, nearly erased by time, a single line remains. The beasts do not speak in our tongues, but through powder we remember theirs. It is not translated as a metaphor. It is taken literally. Imagine now the quiet end of the ceremony. The participant, face cracking under the dry mask, sits again before the copper mirror. A cloth dipped in rose water wipes away the lines. The beak fades. The mane recedes. The human face returns. Tired, perhaps, but still. The bowl of powder is sealed again. The animal spirit, unspoken, retreats. And the temple is silent. The altar paint meant to turn stone faces into oracles. Imagine the stillness of an ancient temple at dusk. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, and the air is beginning to cool. Long shadows stretch across the stone floor, and the last light filters through carved slits in the walls, casting narrow lines across the statues within. Incense lingers faintly, spiced, woody, and old. You hear nothing at first, and then, perhaps, a whisper, just faint enough that you're unsure if it came from your own breath or the walls themselves. In this space, carved faces look out from the walls. Some serene, others stern, all fixed in their expression, their mouths slightly parted. These aren't mere decorations. According to temple tradition, they were once more than stone. They were voices. They were watchers. And some believed they could speak. But they did not do so alone. At the heart of this belief was a ritual practice that has largely faded from memory. The application of specific pigments, paints made not to beautify the statues, but to transform them. Applied not randomly, but with intention. Red on the lips, black around the eyes, sometimes a line of ochre down the nose, or a ring around the forehead. These colors were not for display. They were invitations. Pigments were made from crushed minerals, mixed with oil or egg or water. Red from iron-rich ochre, black from soot or charcoal, blue from ground azurite. Each had its meaning. Red for vitality or warning, black for mystery, for protection. The paints were applied during specific ritual moments, usually just before sunset, when light changed and the space shifted from sacred to liminal. At this hour, temple corridors often caught the wind, not strong gusts, but soft movements, drawn in through narrow passageways, moving through chambers in gentle sighs. The architecture itself was designed to encourage this, not as an accident, but as a feature. Priests and builders knew how air moved, how sound carried, how voices echoed when the walls were shaped just so. When the wind passed through these painted chambers, it made sounds, whispers, sometimes soft whistles, barely audible murmurs that bounced between statues and alcoves. Believers, kneeling in the growing dark, claimed the painted faces were speaking, that the pigments, freshly applied, had awakened the statues, that prayers had been heard, and now were being answered. It's important to understand that in the worldview of many ancient cultures, objects weren't passive. A statue wasn't just a symbol of a god. It could, at times, become the god, or at least a vessel. The act of painting, of anointing, of adorning, was not superficial. It was transformational. Paint made stone receptive. It gave it breath. Temple records, rare and often fragmentary, mention the painting of statues as part of a larger rite called the opening of the mouth. In some cultures, this rite was performed for the dead. In others, for statues themselves, so they could see, smell, speak. And while the ritual varied, the concept remained. To make the inanimate animate, at least for a moment. The painted stone faces weren't permanent oracles. The paint faded quickly. Dust settled. Wind patterns shifted with the seasons. But for those who experienced it, even once, the effect could be profound. A whispered sound during a desperate prayer. A sigh in answer to a question. A murmur that arrived just as a decision was being made. These moments shaped belief. There are carvings on temple walls, faint time-worn, that show figures applying pigment to the lips of statues. Others show pots of color placed beside altars, lids sealed tight. Some archaeologists have found traces of mineral pigments in unlikely places. Within cracks in the stone, on ledges high above eye level, in corners where wind would have passed. Whether the paint physically changed anything is beside the point. It changed perception. It changed experience. And in sacred spaces, experience was reality. Imagine being a devotee walking into the temple on the evening of a festival. You've brought your offering, grain or oil, or a scrap of cloth. You enter the painted chamber alone. The air is still. The statue before you stares silently. Its lips are crimson. Its eyes are black-ringed. You kneel. You speak your worry aloud. And then, in the pause, the corridor breathes. You hear something. You can't say what. It isn't speech exactly, but it moves the hairs on your neck. You feel it in your bones. The paint glows faintly in the last of the light. And for a moment, you believe the stone is not just watching, but listening. Not just present, but aware. This was not performance. It was ritual. And rituals work not only because of what they do, but because of what they create. Stillness, expectation, focus, a space in which the boundary between self and world softens, in which a whisper can be mistaken or understood as an answer. Priests understood the importance of timing. Paints were reapplied only on specific days. The wind was anticipated. The sound was managed. And belief, once planted, sustained itself, even as temple hierarchy shifted. Even as foreign gods entered the pantheon and old rites faded into private practice, some of these customs endured. Village shrines with small painted figurines. Household idols with eyes darkened by soot. The belief that a carved face could do more than watch, that it could witness, speak, warn, remained. Today, many of these temple statues survive without their color. Time has stripped them back to bare stone. But if you look closely, you might still find faint traces. Red in a crease, black in a corner. And if you walk the same corridors, you might hear the same soft wind. Feel the same sudden hush as you pass from one chamber to another. And maybe, just maybe, something will stir. A sound. A shape in the shadow. Not loud. Not clear. But enough to make you pause. And that pause, that moment of belief, however small, is the real echo of the ritual. The lingering power of a painted whisper. The quiet voice of a stone face, awakened not by magic, but by memory. The black wax that could make statues cry at night. Imagine walking through a temple at night. The outer world has gone still. The markets are closed. The fires have dimmed to embers. Inside the temple walls, the air is thick with incense, sweet bitter, and curling slowly toward a high ceiling lost in darkness. The stone underfoot is cold, the silence deep. But at the end of a corridor lined with painted scenes, a flickering oil lamp reveals something strange. A statue stands at the heart of the room, immense, unmoving, carved from dark stone. But from its eyes, a black streak trails downward, thick and glistening, as if the figure weeps. You have not entered at the wrong time. You are not seeing things. This is the morning ritual, and the tears are deliberate. The ancients once called it summoning grief for the gods. In certain temples, during the nights following royal funerals, seasonal transitions, or national tragedies, priests and attendants would anoint divine statues with a special substance. A waxy, pitch-dark form of coal, so dense it held its shape, but soft enough to melt with time. The application was precise. The black wax was pressed gently beneath the statue's eyes, tracing a thick lower lid. Then a small lamp or brazier was lit and placed nearby, not to burn, but to warm. As hours passed, the heat softened the coal, and it began to melt in slow, uneven streaks. These were the tears of gods, drawn forth not by sorrow, but by the hands of the faithful. This was not a trick. It was a devotion. To mourn was to honor. And in the ancient imagination, if people could grieve, so too could gods. But statues could not move. So the rituals helped them speak in the only language available, symbol. Temple walls contain quiet descriptions of this rite. In chambers where sacred dramas were performed behind screens, Inscriptions record the ingredients used to create the wax. Charcoal or burnt resin mixed with beeswax, soot from oil lamps, sometimes a drop of sacred myrrh or cedar oil. The mixture was warmed, blended, and stored in small alabaster pots. Before use, it was reheated slightly, then applied with a flat-tipped tool made of ivory or polished wood. The statue was prepared beforehand, washed, perfumed, dressed in linen. Then in darkness, the black wax was applied. The priests did not speak. The room was silent except for the crackle of flame and the occasional shifting of robes on stone. No mourning wails, no drama, just heat and time. When the tears began to fall, no one touched them. The wax slid slowly down the statue's cheeks, pooling near the chin or jawline. It was never wiped away. To do so was to interrupt divine sorrow. Instead, the next morning, after the ritual ended, attendants collected the hardened trails and stored them in small jars. These cooled remnants were believed to hold lingering power. Grief crystallized, grief made permanent. Some of these jars have been recovered, still sealed, still dark, still labeled with simple lines. Tears of Ammonius, weeping of Hathor, grief for the great passing. In some rites, these remnants were buried beneath tomb thresholds, or dissolved in oil and poured into sacred fires. In others, they were offered to rivers, sent back to the gods from whom the grief had flowed. This practice may seem strange now, but it touches something familiar. When we mourn, we light candles, we lay flowers, we wear black, or remain silent, or write names on walls. We create shape for something shapeless. Grief given form so it can be seen. The ancients did this too, and in their temples, that shape was a streak of melting black beneath the eye of a statue. It was also theatrical, in a way. The priests did not deny this. They described the melting Kohl as drawing out the soul's sorrow. It was known the statue could not feel, but still, it was a bridge, a way to bring emotion into stone and make it visible, if only for a night. And consider the softness of that idea, that even gods, unmoving and eternal, should be allowed to mourn. That grief was not weakness, but sacred. That tears were not hidden, but summoned. Imagine now a row of statues, large and small, lined in a temple gallery. Each has been prepared. Each stands in a pool of warm light from clay lamps. The wax has begun to glisten. Not all have melted yet. Some remain dry-eyed. Others show early trails. The attendants stand at a distance. No voices rise. There is only the sound of the wax slowly shifting and the flicker of grief made visible. This ritual faded over time, like many others. Later generations remembered it dimly. A reference in a scroll. A half-melted jar discovered in a buried storeroom. But some scholars believe echoes of the idea lived on. In the theatrical tear lines of mourning masks, in the dark Kohl worn at funerals, in the belief that statues could hold emotion when humans could not. And in this way, grief, so often quiet, unspoken, hard to name, found a language through heat and wax, through pigment and shadow, through something as simple as a line that falls unnoticed in the night. Sleep now with that image, that once, when sorrow came too heavy for words, people placed black wax beneath stone eyes and waited for the statue to weep. The skin balm that glowed during solstice rites. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a desert, just as twilight yields to night. The last gold of the sun fades, and the stars begin their slow unveiling across the sky. One by one, then all at once. In the distance, torches flicker in a wide circle, surrounding a stone platform carved directly into the earth. Music echoes low and rhythmic. Drums, flutes, the soft rattle of dried seed pods. This is a solstice night, an event that marked not only the turning of the seasons, but the alignment of human bodies with celestial rhythms. In many ancient cultures, Solstices were not just seasonal markers, they were portals, times when the distance between heaven and earth narrowed. And within these ceremonies, one of the most enigmatic rituals involved a luminous balm, applied to the skin, catching the firelight, and casting dancers in an otherworldly glow. The balm itself was a closely guarded preparation. Though its ingredients varied by region, records and residues suggest a key component remained consistent. The finely ground shells of iridescent beetles, likely a type of scarab or jewel beetle, prized for their natural shimmer. These shells, crushed to a fine powder, were mixed with oils derived from seeds, tree resin, and sometimes beeswax. The result was a thick, aromatic paste that shimmered green, blue, or gold when touched by flame. On the longest night of the year, this balm was applied in long, sweeping motions across the arms, chest, and face of each participant. It was not worn by all, only by those chosen to dance at the center of the temple space, under open sky, in direct view of the gods. These dancers were often selected months in advance and underwent purification rites in the days leading up to the solstice. To understand the balm's purpose, it helps to consider how ancient people viewed light, not merely as illumination, but as presence. Light meant life, vision, clarity, and, most importantly, divine favor. The sun was not a source, but a being. Its return after the long night was never assumed. It had to be honored, coaxed, welcomed. By covering the body in a substance that glowed under torchlight, the dancers transformed themselves into emissaries of this light. They did not represent themselves, but celestial forces made visible. Their bodies became moving prayers, shifting, spinning, rising into stillness, and collapsing back to earth in rhythms passed down for generations. Stone carvings found in surviving temples depict these rites in detail. In one panel, a line of dancers move in unison, arms arched upward, the shimmer of their skin captured by delicate incisions filled with mineral inlay. The figures seem to glow even now, lit by torchlight only in memory. Nearby, a short inscription reads, "They bore the light so it might return." The ritual was often timed to the precise moment of solstice midnight. At that hour, when the sun was at its furthest reach and the world held its breath, the dancers reached the peak of their movement. The torches were raised, and the balm caught the light, sparkling not in one direction, but in many, as though the dancers were covered in fragments of the sky itself. Observers described the sight as deeply moving. The balm did not simply shine. It shifted, refracted, seeming to move with the dancer's pulse. In some accounts, those watching believed they could see patterns emerge on the skin. Stars, spirals, the outline of wings. Whether this was real, imagined, or induced by the late hour and the hypnotic rhythm, the experience was unforgettable. And when the dance ended, when the last shimmer faded into stillness, the dancers returned to the inner chambers of the temple, where they were washed by attendants with water infused with cedar and salt. The cloths used to remove the balm were not discarded. They were buried at the foot of the altar, wrapped tightly and marked with a sigil unique to the ritual year. Interestingly, some ancient texts suggest that the balm was considered too potent for daytime. It belonged to the edge of night, too sacred to be seen in full daylight, lest its power be spent. A few lines even caution that to wear the balm outside of the solstice ritual was to draw unwanted attention from the divine. To shine when the heavens sleep is to challenge the stars, one inscription reads. In recent archaeological studies, trace residues of beetle shell compounds have been detected on the inner walls of ceremonial basins and mixing palettes. When analyzed under light, these fragments still refract color, proof of a substance meant not to last, but to be seen in a moment of sacred transition. And perhaps that was the point. The glow did not endure. It was made to rise and vanish like the solstice itself, a glimpse of radiance precisely because it was fleeting. Today, it is easy to forget how carefully ancient people marked the sky, how deeply they watch the sun's movement, the stars' return, the timing of shadow. The bomb, the dance, the fire. They were not decorations. They were dialogue, embodied ways of saying, "We see you. We await you. Return to us." And in return, the dancers glowed, not from the bomb alone, but from the belief that the body, when moved in rhythm and marked in light, could become a message visible to the cosmos. So now, if you find yourself beneath a solstice sky, with stars just beginning to emerge and the air still warm from the day, imagine them. A circle of figures moving in silence, each streaked in gleaming green and gold, each motion a word, each shimmer a promise that the sun would rise again. The paint that let priests read words in mirror reflection. Imagine yourself in a small chamber deep inside a temple complex, its walls thick enough to keep out the noise of wind and street life beyond. The floor is smooth stone, the air scented faintly with oil, old ink, and crushed mineral dust. You are watching a priest at the close of twilight. His head shaved, robes linen white, sleeves pushed high on his forearms. On the table before him, set not for food but for ritual, rests a small, polished mirror and a shallow dish of red-black pigment. He leans forward, dips his ring finger into the paste, and gently brushes it across one closed eyelid. In the stillness, he does not speak. He lifts the mirror slowly, angles it just so, and then opens his eye. On the underside of the table, barely visible unless the light is right, are carved symbols, but not in normal script. They are reversed, mirror-etched, so they appear meaningless to the naked eye. But when seen through the reflection, when looked upon using that painted eye, they become legible. Not words for the public, not chants for the crowd, but quiet instructions, personal invocations, private truths. This was a practice known only to certain ritual scribes and temple keepers, usually those who served in shrines too sacred for others to enter. The technique was called by some scholars reflected script, though no official name survives. It relied not only on reversed writing, but on a specific pigment, dark, thick, reflective, applied directly to the eyelid to sharpen the mind's focus and filter distraction. To most, the act would seem theatrical, but for the priest, it was a ritual of narrowing attention. The pigment, usually made from a blend of ground hematite, soot, and plant oil, created a sense of pressure on the eye. A weight one could only read when still, only perceive when the mirror and light aligned. It demanded calm, silence, precision. In this way, reading became not a mechanical act, but a meditation. The origins of this practice are difficult to trace. The earliest signs come not from scrolls, but from the ritual tables themselves, stone surfaces found in tomb chapels and small sanctuaries. Their undersides were often left bare, but a few, remarkably, bear etchings symmetrical, deeply incised lines that appear nonsensical until reversed. Most are short, names, brief prayers, fragments of myth. Some are longer, offering instructions about which god to invoke or which scent to burn. But all are reversed, and all seem meant to be read in reflection. In tombs where such tables were found, there were often also mirrors, carefully placed, polished to a near-metallic sheen, sometimes made from bronze, sometimes obsidian. A few even had faint fingerprints on the back edge, as if regularly held. These mirrors were not decorative. They were tools. The pigment, too, is sometimes found, sealed in pots labeled not with cosmetic markers, but with terms like seeing ink or eye of fire. Though these translations are debated, the implication is clear. This was not makeup, but a focusing agent. Something to sharpen inner vision as much as outer. Why reversed writing? In a culture where writing was sacred and often restricted, the mirror served as both gate and key. It allowed messages to be hidden in plain sight. Only those trained to read backward could understand, and only those willing to undergo the full ritual, applying the pigment, holding the mirror, waiting for clarity, could truly receive the message. There are suggestions in some priestly manuals, written more openly on papyrus, that knowledge must be earned through reversal, that truth seen too easily might be misused, that mirrors, like gods, do not give freely. One passage reads, "Only when the eye looks into itself does the writing open." Another warns, "Let the surface be still, or the gods will remain silent." Some scholars have speculated that the pigment acted like a mild irritant, just enough to heighten concentration. Others believe it simply marked the eye, signaling to those present that the reader had entered the ritual state. A few mirrors found with these kits have inscriptions around the rim. "Let what is reflected be truth," or "Do not blink, lest it vanish." Whether literal or metaphorical, the effect was consistent. The reader saw only when still, silent, prepared. In time, the practice faded. As temple rituals changed and access to sacred texts broadened, the use of mirror script declined. But its traces remain. In tomb inventories, in fragmentary writings, in a few remarkably preserved ritual tables where the carvings on the underside still shimmer faintly under raking light. And perhaps most strikingly, in the act itself, one that crosses cultures and centuries. The quiet moment of reflection, the use of the eye not merely to see, but to receive, the understanding that certain truths cannot be read directly, but must be turned, mirrored, softened through ritual. Now, imagine again the priest, alone in that quiet chamber, the mirror balanced in hand, the pigment cooling on his lid. He opens his eye, not quickly, not forcefully, but slowly, as if peering into something deeper than the table. For a moment, the symbols shimmer, resolve into meaning, and pass into memory. And then the mirror is set down, the pigment wiped away, the words gone once more. Let your thoughts rest there, in a room lit by oil, where the world is reversed but somehow clearer, and where silence is not empty, but full of what can only be seen when everything else is still. The palette that could only be used by the bloodline's last daughter. Imagine the stillness of a sealed chamber deep beneath a temple, untouched by weather, untouched even by light. The air is dry, undisturbed for centuries. On one side of the room, a carved stone bench remains perfectly intact. Resting atop it is a low wooden box, lacquered in faded red and bound with cords that once shimmered with gold. Inside, a tray of pigments, carefully arranged, each nestled in a small carved basin. The colors remain vibrant: ochre, deep blue, iron red, and an unfamiliar shade somewhere between silver and ash. Next to the tray, an inscription. It is not long, just a few words, smoothed by time. For the last to carry the name. This is not a palette for daily use, not for celebration, not for court, not even for mourning. This was a palette of finality, reserved for a single woman, living at the end of a line, a daughter not merely descended from a bloodline, but charged with closing it. She is depicted nearby, on a relief carved into the chamber wall. Her posture is serene. One hand raises a brush toward her cheek. The other cradles the tray. Her eyes gaze outward, not at the living, but at something beyond the veil. Her skin is painted with a faint glow, as if light were drawn toward her. Beneath the relief, a phrase. She prepares her name for weighing. This was the rite of judgment, not in the judicial sense, but in the ritual understanding of passage. And the palette, preserved, hidden, labeled, was her only companion. In many ancient cultures, lineage carried weight beyond ancestry. It held spiritual continuity. Names were vessels for memory. To end a line was not just to pass unnoticed into history, but to close a thread of identity that stretched across generations. For most, such endings came silently. But in rare cases, families prepared for them, ritually, symbolically, and with great care. The last daughter, in this context, was not simply the final child born. She was designated, chosen, or sometimes revealed by circumstance. Whether through war, illness, exile, or fate, she became the bearer of legacy and its final scribe. The pigments reserved for her were not decorative. They were mnemonic. Each color corresponded to an ancestor. One represented the founder of the line, another a marriage that joined houses, another a broken vow or a restored honor. The silver ash shade is the most curious. In ritual poetry, it is described as the hue of names unspoken, a color not found in any crown or garment, but only here. Before the judgment rite, the last daughter would enter the burial chamber alone. This was not an act of fear or sacrifice, but of quiet preparation. She was not buried alive. She did not vanish. She returned, but when she entered, she was herself, and when she emerged, she carried no name. The palette was applied sparingly, not painted in bold strokes, but tapped gently onto the skin. Temples, chin, the bridge of the nose. Each gesture was deliberate, echoed by inscriptions on the walls that mirrored her actions. A kind of choreography, unchanging. One verse, etched into the lintel of a burial chamber, reads, "To color the skin is to show the spirit's thread. To wear the line is to unweave it. To be seen is to vanish complete." This paradox, visibility as vanishing, was central to the rite. Her face, marked with ancestral tones, would appear briefly to those performing the weighing ritual. And then, washed clean, the pigments returned to the tray. The lid closed, the name sealed. Archaeologists have uncovered only a few such palettes, all buried in secluded vaults. They share certain features. Trays carved from the same wood, sealed in the same manner, and always bearing inscriptions naming no specific individual. Only the role, last daughter. No male equivalent has yet been found, though some scholars suspect such rites existed in other forms. Perhaps sons ended houses through deed, while daughters did so through remembrance. In either case, the conclusion of a bloodline was not viewed with shame, but reverence. To live as the last was to hold the weight of memory, to speak it, to wear it, and then to return it to silence. In the relief carvings, the last daughter's expression is always calm. There is no grief in her posture, no desperation, only stillness. Her face is often framed by symbols that resemble woven thread, or in some cases, a closing eye. The act is not one of disappearance, but of completion, and the palette remains. Never reused, never passed down. After the rite, it is returned to its box, the cord tied again, the lid sealed with wax or clay. Some were buried with the woman, others were stored in alcoves known only to temple stewards. One palette, found sealed behind a false wall, contained a note scratched faintly onto the underside of its lid. The colors know. I do not. It is easy to forget, in a world shaped by kings and conquest, that some histories were written with powder, not ink, with gestures, not proclamations, that the closing of a lineage was not marked by bells or banners, but by a quiet ceremony no one witnessed except for the dead. Imagine the last daughter standing in that chamber, holding the palette. Imagine the feel of fine powder between her fingertips, the slow stroke of color against the skin. Not to transform, not to conceal, but to carry memory into silence. And when she steps back into the daylight, her face washed clean, she walks forward not as an heir, but as an echo, one that fades gently into the stone. The temple where the makeup was etched into the walls forever. Imagine a temple carved into the hillside, its outer facade worn smooth by wind and sun, but its inner chambers still cool and still. Light filters only in slivers through high windows, casting narrow beams onto walls inscribed with row after row of careful lines. Symbols, not of battles or kings, but of recipes. Measurements, mixtures, instructions not for food or medicine, but for pigment. Here, in this temple, Makeup was not stored in jars alone. It was written, carved, permanently, into stone. In many ancient cultures, makeup was far more than decoration. It was protection, ritual, identity, and offering. To line the eyes was to ward off disease. To color the skin was to connect with gods. And in some temples, especially those where rites for both the living and the dead overlapped, cosmetics held a deeper role, balancing two worlds. Rather than rely solely on memory or containers that could break or be lost, priests inscribed entire pigment formulas into the temple walls. These carvings were precise, methodical, and durable. They detailed not just ingredients, but sequences, proportions, and timing. How long a paste should rest in shadow, or which day of the lunar cycle was best for grinding resin. These weren't simply lists. They were embedded rituals, meant to endure beyond the lives of those who read them. A recipe might begin with galena, a mineral that produced the rich black coal used to line eyes. It would instruct the exact amount, measured in terms of seeds or drops of water. Then a binding oil, pressed from plants harvested in early morning. Then a whisper, a line of instruction directing the reader to recite a blessing before mixing. These carved directions often included prayers, embedded seamlessly with process. One wall, for example, might detail the red pigment used for anointing the statues of the gods at dusk. Another might hold the exact formula used to mark the faces of the dead before burial rites, believed to help the soul recognize itself in the afterlife. Every pigment had a purpose, and every purpose needed to be remembered. But memory, as the priests knew, was fragile. Clay tablets could crack. Papyrus could decay. Even jars of pigment, if sealed improperly, could dry to dust. But stone endured. And so they chiseled. The act of inscribing wasn't hurried. It was part of the sacred process. One priest might mix the pigment, while another slowly etched the formula nearby. This dual creation, material and memory, was seen as protective. The balance between ephemeral use and eternal record ensured that the recipe's power could not be lost, even if the supply was. Over time, the walls of these chambers grew crowded. Pigments for healing, for ceremony, for marking the brow of a statue on festival days, for tracing the spiral on a woman's arm during a fertility rite. Each with its own formula, each with its own meaning. These inscriptions weren't always visible to the public. Many were carved deep within inner sanctuaries, where only initiated priests would enter. Some were even concealed behind false panels or screens, visible only during specific rites, not because the knowledge was secret in the modern sense, but because access to it had to be earned. Learning to read the wall was part of one's sacred training. Interestingly, the carved recipes didn't always match the pigments found in storage. Sometimes a jar labeled with a symbol would contain a slightly different mix than what was on the wall. Scholars suggest this could reflect adaptations, seasonal changes, shifts in resource availability, but the original recipes were never removed. They were kept as anchors, as the ideal. This fixation on permanence reveals something deeper about the culture of these temples. They were not only places of prayer, but of preservation. To keep the world in balance, between the seen and unseen, the now and the forever, required continuity. The pigment used to mark a god's face had to be the same across generations. The mixture brushed onto the dead had to carry the same scent and color as it had centuries before. To change it was to risk confusion in the afterlife, to misalign worlds. Even today, fragments of these carved recipes survive. In ruined sanctuaries, explorers and archaeologists have found pigment traces caught in grooves. Red still vibrant after centuries, black still embedded deep in the cuts. The mineral composition can be analyzed, the instructions translated, and though we no longer follow these rites, the weight of their intention remains. Imagine yourself in such a temple now. You trace your hand lightly across a carved line. Symbol shaped by a chisel over 2,000 years ago. Dust has settled. Light flickers. But the words are still there. You're reading a formula that once darkened the eyes of a priest before he stood beneath the stars. A mixture that once marked the cheekbones of a statue brought out during a procession no one remembers. A recipe etched to outlast time. And perhaps in that quiet space, you begin to understand. These weren't just cosmetic instructions. They were a promise, a way to say this mattered, a way to ensure that when the body failed, when the walls crumbled, when memory faded, the ingredients would remain. Written not on paper, not whispered into air, but held fast in stone. It's a reminder that even the smallest rituals, mixing a paste, brushing a face, can carry great meaning when repeated across generations. That balance, for these ancient people, was not found in grand declarations, but in the steady hand of someone preserving the formula exactly as it had always been. The wall holds the words. The temple holds the silence. And in between them, history rests, layered not just in pigment, but in intention, quiet, carved, and eternal.